Hello and a very warm welcome to a brand new edition of World Panorama with me, Frank Pereira. Over the next half an hour, we'll bring you a roundup of all the significant events to have taken place around the world this week. But first, a look at the headlines. Economic deals and Make in India pitch dominate Prime Minister Narendra Modi's three-nation East Asia tour alongside positives on the strategic front. Bilateralism extending to regional interests, say analysts. Big gains for Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Key Iraqi town of Ramadi falls to the militant group. Concern for architectural treasures in Syria's Pereira city as the militants take control. Malaysia and Thailand agree to help shelter thousands of migrants coming in from Myanmar and Bangladesh. EU decides on military action against human traffickers in the Mediterranean. Juventus win the prized Coppa Italia, keeping them on course for a treble. Alessandro Matri, the unexpected hero with his extra-time winner that sinks Lazio in the final. And it's glamour and glitter galore at Cannes Film Festival as stars and film critics swarm to the Riviera city to sift through some of the finest silver screen projects of the year. Well, our top focus this week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's three-nation visit to East Asia that concluded this week has rejuvenated several old bridges and is seen as yet another feather in the cap for his successful foreign policy initiatives. Let's look back on the tour as we look to analyze the positives and the road ahead. Here's more.
Asia will succeed more when all of Asia rises together.
Prime Minister Modi addressing the Asian Leadership Forum in Seoul on the last day of his six-nation tour. South Korean Prime Minister Park Geun-hye and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon were present. Strategic ties with East Asia, an effort to tap the huge trade potential while pitching his pet Make in India program, remained the thrust of visits to China, Mongolia and South Korea. The China leg was perhaps the most closely watched, both for the strategic and business outcomes as also the atmospherics. 24 agreements worth $10 billion signed between the two governments, besides 26 business deals worth $22 billion between business leaders on both sides, setting the stage for cooperation in key areas of the economy as well as plans for landmark business synergies.
This is one of our most important strategic partnerships. The reason is obvious. The re-emergence of India and China and their relationship will have a profound impact on the two countries and the course of this century.
Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Mongolia, more a relationship-building visit in the wider context of Asia. An address to the Mongolian Parliament and India extending a $1 billion line of credit were the highlights here. The third and last stop was South Korea, equally critical, particularly from the business point of view. The meeting with CEOs, the visit to the Hyundai headquarters, calls for pooling information and technology, urban renewal and the cultural ties. They all spoke of a reaching out with strengths India's markets had to offer.
India was and is a land of potentials. Now, India is also a land of enabling policy environment. Moreover, there is renewed commitment of my government for changing the face of the country. We can join hands in the mutual benefit of our people and industry.
The six-day visit had a strong stress on inclusive growth in Asia through united efforts, urging Asian nations to shun regionalism, putting forward a promise of action beyond rhetoric.
मेरी सरकार की नीति का एक महत्वपूर्ण हिस्सा है, खास करके विदेश नीति का, और वो है एक्ट ईस्ट पॉलिसी। पहले था लुक ईस्ट पॉलिसी।
Well, I spoke to former Ambassador Suresh Goel earlier on the wider significance of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi's tour to the three nations, and this is what he had to say. Let's take a look. Prime Minister Narendra Modi just got back from his three-nation visit earlier this week to China, Mongolia and South Korea. And to analyze the strategic and economic gains, I have with me former Ambassador Suresh Goel. Ambassador, thank you for joining me on the program. And, let's talk about the kind of influence that Prime Minister Modi's visit to China, Mongolia and South Korea has had, not just on India, but on the world as well. But do you think that we've made some significant inroads as far as bettering ties with these three nations are concerned?
I certainly think that the visit was very, very important. China visit came after some time, though not very long after Xi Jinping visited India last year, or earlier this year in fact. So it was in a sense to underline the importance of the bilateral relations between India and China. When I say the bilateral relations between India and China, I would like to underline one thing, that the relationship between the two countries, even though bilateral in nature, that bilateralism has gone beyond just bilateral interest really. It impinges a lot on the regional interests, on the global communications, on the global factors.
On this visit, we've seen a lot of bonhomie between India and China, and both leaders, in fact, leaders of both the countries have come out and said how much both countries can benefit out of mutual cooperation.
Absolutely.
But can India really trust China after 1961?
Let us not say can India trust. In the international relations, we do not talk can we trust or not. We don't have any options but to trust and to work on the basis of some confidence or trust. Unless those trust and the confidence we find are belied, in which case we take precautions. So in that sense, we don't have options but to really go ahead with our own national interests in an interaction with China. And those national interests now actually spread over India as well as Southeast Asia, as well as the Gulf and other areas. So we have a great deal of convergence and divergence of interest, and we have to work within those things. Boundary is only one of them. Economic cooperation is very, very important. The security architecture in Southeast Asia is another important factor on which we have to work.
Several contentious issues were brought up but not discussed thoroughly in China, and even in South Korea we saw that happening because POSCO was not really discussed in detail.
Yes.
In China, several contentious issues, for instance the stapled visa issue, the land border agreement issue, and several of the other issues were not really discussed at length. Was that an area of concern, or do you think that what was discussed was good enough?
I don't think that we need to dwell too much on not discussing certain issues at length. Those issues were discussed in the appropriate manner, in the right kind of lengths. They were flagged. There is no point discussing something for 2 days when we know that our concerns have been flagged, they have been taken note, and we cannot go beyond that stage for the time being really. The border issues is something on which the special representatives are talking. I mean, we know that we cannot expect or anticipate a great deal of movement on that issue in the near term really, unless there is a new package. So why flog the issue when there are other more important things to talk about?
The near and far future belongs to the Asians is something, it was the mantra that all the leaders chanted. Do you believe that we are heading in that particular direction? Because even the IMF and several other organizations have said that the Indian, Chinese and even for that matter South Korean economies are the ones to watch out for. So is there something to it, or do you think it's just rhetoric?
I think basically when the IMF or the World Bank or the other organizations, they keep on talking about the GDP growth rate, India and China, the fastest growing economies, there's a lot of really, the usual things. It doesn't mean anything to me really in that sense, except a sense of satisfaction that yes, we are now growing faster than China. For how many years, I don't know. China has taken us by surprise on many different occasions. But yes, it is going to be the century of Asia, considering the way the economy is growing here. If you look at the international issues, if you look at the energy issues, the infrastructural development, the market growth, there's no doubt about it. And in that Asian century, important thing for us to know really is what role will India play in terms of what China is already playing and what China will play. South Korean, they are a large economy now compared to what they were 20 years ago.
Yes, indeed.
They have grown rapidly. So are many other economies going. Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia.
South Korea has several giants as far as electronics and some of the other industries are concerned. But there was a different approach used for China by Prime Minister Modi, a different approach used for Korea as well. But one thing was for sure, in both places he pitched Make in India. But in China, defense was not raised at all. But in Korea, defense was a sector that was elaborately discussed, wasn't it?
The approach simply was to build on the commonalities that we share with each country and develop on those commonalities to develop a good structure for the future relations really. Obviously, you can't talk defense relationship or the defense manufacturing with China. We have a different system in India. But when we talk about joint exercises, that is a defense collaboration. In the case of South Korea, we are talking about manufacturing. Obviously, because South Korea has a very, very strong manufacturing base. He spoke about Buddhism as a kind of ties which bind us to China, Mongolia, and he talked about Ayodhya in the case of South Korea. So essentially the elements were which could differ from country to country, the cultural ties historically, the economic possibilities of collaboration and participation, and building on these to come to some kind of a strategic consensus in which our joint or our competition or the perceptions of rivalries could be reduced to basically a cooperation rather than confrontation. So I think the approach was similar. Elements were different as they are bound to be in the case of different countries.
Indeed, indeed.
Mongolia was very important. The first ever visit to Mongolia clearly conveyed that for India, Mongolia is an important country irrespective of its economic size or the political size.
An important message sent out to Mongolia, an important message sent out to other countries as well. An important visit, of course, of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to those three nations. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for putting things into perspective for us and sharing your expertise on this particular subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, on that note, we'll slip into a short break now, but still to come, humanitarian concerns peak in Yemen as Saudi Arabia restarts airstrikes after a 5-day truce. Calls made for breaks in fighting to rush in aid to cut off areas. That and much more coming up. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Rajya Sabha Television. Well, a key Iraqi city, the strategic town of Ramadi, fell to Islamic State militants this week, marking a major setback to the fight against Islamic State. Reports say Iraqi forces were virtually driven out of the city by IS militants, with thousands of civilians fleeing too. The US has voiced confidence that it would retake Ramadi soon, but all parameters suggest that it won't be easy. Here's a report.
A big victory for Islamic State ambitions in Iraq and a massive blow to the Iraq-US coalition. The IS onslaught in Ramadi, the military command center of the strategic Anbar province, killed over 500 people. And on Sunday, the Iraqi army that had dug its heels in thus far saw sense in fleeing before they too faced a bloodbath. The state headquarters itself were emptied out as the feared IS takes control of the city. Close to 25,000 people fled the town with them, moving towards capital Baghdad, less than 100 kilometers east.
صارت أحداث يعني مو طبيعية، إرهاب كلش صار بالشوارع، صار ذبح وصارت قذائف توقع وقصف يجي عشوائي على العوائل، واللي يقولون إنه عوائل دخلوا عليهم كتلوهم والنسوان قاموا يركضون بالشوارع.
The fall of Ramadi to the Islamic State comes as the biggest defeat for Iraqi forces since the setback in Tikrit in March last year. Though Tikrit has been recovered with the help of Shia militia, key stronghold Mosul as well as vast areas in the north and in Syria remain with the Islamic State. Like for Tikrit, once again Iraq has been forced to call in Shia militia groups from Iran to try and retake Ramadi. something it did not want to do given the Sunni population in the city and fears of sectarian strife. The Iranian defense minister visited Baghdad too for a deal on the matter, something Iraq fights shy of. US forces too have been carrying out incessant bombings in Ramadi, even as the country recognizes the significance of this loss and the uphill task the coalition forces face against the Islamic State.
So there's no denying that this is a setback, but there's also no denying that the United States will help the Iraqis take back Ramadi. As of today, we are supporting the Iraqi security forces and the government of Iraq with precision airstrikes and advice to the Iraqi forces. Our aircraft are in the air and searching for ISIL targets, and they will continue to do so until Ramadi is retaken.
Analysts even say the fall of Ramadi comes as a massive blow for the counter-attack against the Islamic State in Iraq. Hopes of normalcy, they say, recede further into the distance.
It also sets back the clock on what we had hoped would be by now a preparation for a counterattack against Mosul, the largest and most important city that ISIL holds. And yet that would now seem to be even further into the future.
For the Islamic State, Ramadi is a massive victory, a reinforcement to the strength and influence the group has achieved in Mosul further north. They even term it the beginning of a further expansion into South Iraq. Even till a day before Ramadi fell, the Iraqi leadership had insisted they would hold out against the IS. They couldn't, and the body blow will take some detailed strategizing to remedy. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
And in more news of the Islamic State's expansion, jihadists from the group seized full control of the ancient Syrian city of Pereira on Thursday, putting the World Heritage Site at risk of destruction. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said IS now control half of all territory in the war-torn country. Reports say that the regime's troops collapsed and withdrew from their positions without resistance. The capture of the ancient city, which houses colonnaded streets and ruined temples that date back thousands of years, has raised fears that its treasures could be plundered like archaeological sites overrun by the jihadists in Iraq. Since IS launched its assault on the city on May 13th, at least 462 people have been killed in fighting, including 71 civilians, some of whom were executed by the jihadists.
قواذف رشاشات ثقيلة جميع الأماكن في كل النقاط العسكرية حتى النقاط المدنية دوائر دولة بيحاولوا يخربوها يدمروها بيتمركزوا فيها بياخذوا المدنية دروع بشرية ضمن المدينة وخارج المدينة.
Moving on now, Malaysia and Indonesia have said that they will temporarily shelter the slew of migrants coming in from Myanmar and Bangladesh, while insisting that they need the international community's help with resettling them. There's been no let-up in illegal migrants from Bangladesh and Myanmar crossing the high seas in deplorable conditions and looking for asylum in Malaysia, Indonesia and Thailand. The influx has turned into a burning issue for the region. Here's a detailed report.
They pour in along these shorelines almost every other day. Nearly 3,000 have reached land in just the last week. One estimate put the number of these migrants at sea having left Myanmar and Bangladesh at close to 8,000. On these boats in the middle of the Andaman Sea, they've all gone through pathetic conditions: overcrowding, lack of food and water, the ever-looming threat of disaster, exhaustion. An unknown number die on the way. Yet, all that most of them care about is making it to another country and a better future.
Indonesia pun boleh, Malaysia pun boleh, daya saya tu Australia pun boleh, tu Amerika pun boleh, saya kerja boleh makan.
The escalating crisis led to an emergency meeting of foreign ministers of Malaysia, Thailand and Indonesia on Wednesday, the first steps towards framing a policy to take on the problem. There's a broad understanding to provide temporary shelter and humanitarian assistance to the migrants, inviting other countries to help out too.
ดูคนในช่วงเวลาที่จะเป็นจะตายกันอยู่บนน้ำเนี่ยกับกลุ่มที่เข้ามาแล้วเราควรจะได้รับการเอาใจใส่ดูแลจัดการออกไปตั้งถิ่นฐานที่ไหนนะรวมไปถึงการส่งกลับด้วยนะแล้วก็กลุ่มสุดท้ายก็คือกลุ่มที่ยังไม่ได้ออกมาเราจะจัดการเขาอย่างไร นะเพื่อจะป้องปรามไม่ให้มีเหตุการณ์เช่นนี้เกิดขึ้นอีก
In Indonesia, camps have come up to house them, at least temporarily, and conditions again are deplorable. The three nations have come under mounting international pressure to allow boats to land after many overloaded vessels were turned away. The United Nations called for urgent corrective measures.
We are in a global, in a record high level of people forcibly displaced globally, consequently a record high number of people also making sea crossings, large number of migrants to very much the focus does have to be exactly on that, saving lives and having the proper measures in place to deal with people on disembarkation and at other points along their journeys.
Global NGO Human Rights Watch termed the Asian immigrant crisis a deadly ping-pong where the helpless pour in but are shunned, turned away. Perhaps one solution lies in pressure on Myanmar to stop persecution of the Rohingya minority. But more immediate concerns on this beckon for now. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Meanwhile, another part of the world hit by illegal migrations has taken stern steps to counter the problem. European Union ministers have approved plans to establish a naval force to combat people smugglers operating from Libya. The EU Foreign Policy Chief has announced that the aim is to launch the naval operation next month with headquarters in Rome under an Italian admiral. She was speaking after talks with foreign and defence ministers of EU nations. A three-phase EU naval operation against human traffickers would include intelligence gathering, inspection and detection, and finally destruction of those boats and their business models. The EU is struggling to cope with a surge of illegal migrants from Africa and the Middle East crossing the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe. Disrupting the people smuggling networks is part of a wider EU plan for tackling the migration crisis. The European Commission has urged EU states to adopt national quotas for housing migrants to ease the pressure on Italy, Greece and Malta. More than 1,800 migrants have died in the Mediterranean in 2015. That is a 20-fold increase during the same period in 2014. Well, let's take a look now at some other news that made headlines across the world this week in our Globe Watch.
A suicide bomber killed 21 worshippers during Friday prayers in a packed mosque in Shia-dominated area of eastern Saudi Arabia, one of the deadliest assaults in the kingdom in recent years. The Islamic State has claimed responsibility. Witnesses said more than 150 people were praying when the huge explosion ripped through the Imam Ali Mosque in the village of Al-Qadi. Sectarian tensions have been frayed by nearly 2 months of Saudi-led airstrikes on Shia Houthi rebels in neighboring Yemen. Saudi Arabia began fresh airstrikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen soon after the 5-day ceasefire in the country ended on 17th of May. The United Nations World Food Programme has called for predictable emergency halts in the attacks to enable food aid to reach thousands of people who could not be covered during the truce. The UNWFP said truck owners have been slow to enter violence-hit areas. It said insecurity, fuel shortages and other logistical challenges had hindered full implementation of the humanitarian plan during the pause, and thousands of civilians were still encountering enormous difficulties. Is this what the bard of Avon William Shakespeare looked like? That's what botanist and historian Mark Griffiths claims, saying he cracked an ingenious cipher to identify the playwright in an engraving in the 16th century work. A 400-year-old botany book contains what could be the only known portrait of Shakespeare made in his lifetime. It will be 400 years next year since Shakespeare, considered the greatest modern playwright, died in 1616.
Shifting focus now, it's time to bring you up to speed with all the sports news that you might have missed this week. Here's our sports wrap.
Juventus kept their dreams of a treble alive as they won the Coppa Italia after beating Lazio 2-1. Juventus has also won the Serie A for the 4th consecutive time and faced Barcelona in the Champions League final. They fell behind in Rome in the Coppa Italia when Stefan Radu headed Lazio ahead, but Giorgio Chiellini levelled with a fine volley. The final went to extra time before substitute Alessandro Matri lashed home to seal a record 10th cup win. Napoli boss Rafael Benitez has emerged as a leading candidate to become the next Real Madrid manager. Current Real boss Carlo Ancelotti is widely expected to leave his post after the final game of the season against Getafe. Talks between the two parties are underway, with 55-year-old Benitez's Napoli contract due to expire next month, although no agreement has been reached. West Ham have also made contact with the former Liverpool and Chelsea boss. Luis Figo joined Michael van Praag in withdrawing from the FIFA presidential election on 29th May. Ex-Portugal midfielder Figo pulled out on the same day as Van Praag to leave Prince Ali bin Ali Hussein of Jordan as Blatter's only rival. Blatter is a favourite to win a fifth term as president. Each of FIFA's 209 member associations have a vote in the election. And Van Praag, who is president of the Dutch Football Federation, said he will support Prince Ali.
Well, perhaps the biggest global highlight in the world of entertainment this week has been the glamorous Cannes Film Festival that's underway in France. For more than a week, thousands of journalists and industry insiders have swarmed into this Riviera city to sift through titles that will be coming to a theatre near you or just your favourite small screen. Inside the festival headquarters, besides the grand red carpet events hosting some of the film industry's biggest stars and their fashion statements, journalists have raced from screening to screening, while at the film market, business types have bought and sold movies and sometimes projects. Some of the big flicks showcased this year are Carol, Son of Saul, Irrational Men, A Tale of Love and Darkness, among dozens of others. And finally, Dancing for Integration. That's the inspiration behind the Brazilian dance troupe Body in Movement that's gained international attention for its daring routines performed by dancers in wheelchairs. We leave you this week with this scintillating performance. Have a good evening.